The Warren Centre initiated the first fire safety engineering project in 1987 as an extension of the innovation in structural engineering project that we were undertaking at the time. And what became immediately apparent was the highly prescriptive approach to the fire safety engineering design at that time, and this was a major barrier to innovative design. And furthermore, the construction was found to be poorly integrated and legalistic. The Warren Centre engaged with international experts at the time across a broad section of the industry to develop a philosophy and a systemic approach for fire safety engineering in the built environment. That approach has been adopted for design purposes and has generally proven successful in itself. However, it has been recognised, and various events have caused it to be recognised, that the success is dependent on the fire safety engineer having the appropriate qualifications and experience, and things can go wrong. And therefore, today we are launching the next phase of this vital work to take the principles identified in the first project and support them with a nationally consistent framework for fire safety engineering that includes the competency and skills requirements. The project has certainly excited much interest, as evidenced by this large and distinguished group we have with us this evening. And the Warren Centre has received some funding, for which we're most grateful, and that's enabled us to make a significant start. But we need further financial support from you to keep up the work and complete this important project. So we will be in touch, and perhaps more might be said about that. And we are privileged to have Professor Peter Shergold launch our fire safety engineering project today. Peter will be introduced in more detail shortly, but suffice to say that he was, apart from being Chancellor of Western Sydney University, he was co-author of the federal government's Shergold Weir report, Building Confidence. And I might say he was also a driving force for the magnificent win yesterday of the Western Sydney University Solar Challenge car in the World Solar Challenge Championship. I think that's a magnificent effort from, he beat MIT, would you believe, funded by Ford and others. He beat them in the final, which I think is an outstanding effort from Western Sydney. But before Peter cuts the ribbon, and to underline the importance of this project and the opportunity for Australia to play a major role in developing world-leading methods for the appropriate management of fire safety, I'm delighted to introduce Professor José Torero, who is the Warren Centre's distinguished foreign fellow on this project. Professor Torero is an internationally renowned expert in fire safety. He has recently completed a detailed report for the UK Parliament's Grenfell Tower Inquiry, in part focused on examining how and why the fire progressed with such devastating consequences, which we have observed and which shocked us all, I am sure. Professor Torero is a registered professional engineer in Queensland, a chartered engineer under the Engineering Council division in the UK, and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. After many years of research and teaching at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Queensland, in 2017, José was appointed the John L. Bryan Chair in the Department of Fire Protection Engineering at the University of Maryland in the United States. So please join with me to welcome Professor José Torero.
Thank you, Richard, very much for the kind introduction and for opening the proceedings today. I guess the main reason for me to be here is to stress the importance of this Warren Centre project. As Richard mentioned, this is the second Warren Centre project on fire safety engineering, and the first one was one of those landmark activities that pushed transformational process all around the world. The Warren Center project recognized the fact that in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was an enormous advancement in our understanding of fire behavior, of human behavior, of structural behavior in fire, that enabled us to create tools for engineers to be able to design in an explicit way. We were coming from a period, a very, very, very long period of almost 100 years of very, very strict regulations that not only narrowed the capacity of professionals to be able to deliver innovative structures, innovative buildings, but also introduced massive safety factors in many aspects associated to fire safety. So we were coming from an environment where we had oversimplified buildings. We had created situations in which we were imposing extreme levels of protection, and we were introducing measures that were not only expensive but highly overdimensioned. And therefore, there was a need to try to refine, better understand, and trying to improve the way in which we put fire safety as an application into the built environment. Now, all that knowledge was created by the forefathers of our field and individuals that were experts in areas such as combustion, fire safety, structural integrity, material degradation, human behavior, the psychology of people in buildings, sprinkler systems, smoke detection, very, very broad range of disciplines. And all this knowledge had been put together in a way such that it had enabled the creation of numerous tools that now engineers could actually use. So on the basis of that recognition, there was a keen interest around the world, to try to find better and more explicit ways to establish fire safety in buildings. Now, when you think about more explicit and more clear ways of establishing, fire safety, that immediately emphasizes the process that we are going to introduce a process by which we are going to liberalize the set of rules that we were operating with. Now, in certain countries like the United States, that process was extremely slow. In other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, that process was extremely fast. It was accompanied by other drivers. There was accompanied by drivers such as the need to try to reduce energy consumption in buildings, sustainability, the use of novel materials, optimization of structures, all these different elements that effectively required a much more rational view of fire safety because we were an impediment for the progress of the rest of the construction industry. Now, this recognition that this was a way forward to try to integrate us within a community of engineers came also with the recognition that there was a need to develop competency. Now, it seems that this is where we failed. And this is where now we find ourselves in a position where we actually need to revisit what happened between the original Warren Center report and the situation in which we found ourselves today. Somehow, our attempts to introduce competency into the discipline and to create a true profession within fire safety engineering did not have the same level of success as our success in trying to apply engineering tools into rationalizing fire safety engineering. And unfortunately, the Grenfell Tower is a perfect example that reminds us in a very, very painful way of the mistakes that we made. Now, I would like to take a little bit of a step back and explain a little bit what is the feeling today of what is the big lesson that has been learned from the Grenfell Tower fire. So as you all know, June 14th, 2017, there was a very, very small kitchen fire in a residential apartment block in London, in the area of Grenville. And that very, very small kitchen fire, the type of fire that we could consider that has a probability of 1, is the size of a waste paper basket. That fire was capable of breaching the compartment, igniting several components of a cladding system, resulting in a fire that propagated all 23 stories of the building, propagated laterally, trapping eventually 72 people that died in the fire. The fire service found itself in a position where they were completely incapable of understanding the behavior of the building. And therefore, their response towards the fire was to remain within the protocols that they had pre-established for a fire of that nature, and those protocols failed in a very dramatic way. So the question is, how did we get there? What is what happened and what is what we are learning, from this process, and how does that relate to this Warren Center project? Now, if you really think about it, as we introduce the concept of performance-based design, as we introduce the concept of engineering tools into fire safety engineering, we also realized that there was no need anymore for an incredibly rigid regulatory framework. And as we looked into this regulatory framework, we started moving in a direction where the regulatory framework became more guidelines that actually rules. So the original recipe that we had that had to be followed in a very careful way effectively became a series of guidelines that left in between very significant ambiguity. Now, this is actually appropriate. If you actually look at structural engineering codes, if you look at many other areas of engineering that deal with the built environment, you will realize that embedded in those guidelines, there is ambiguity. Now, ambiguity is actually not a bad thing. It is what enables an engineer to be able to make choices. This is what gives you the freedom to innovate, and it gives you the opportunity to be able to create leaner solutions. But as that ambiguity started expanding, so becomes the need for competency. The problem is, as you start creating ambiguity, then you start creating the need for somebody to interpret that ambiguity and to interpret it in an appropriate way. So effectively, you become more and more and more reliant on competency. And as you're becoming more and more reliant on competency, then your efforts into trying to structure and well-define competency become necessary. Now, the fact that we have more flexibility then enables to introduce new products. As we introduce new products, we started changing the complexity of the systems. So if we look at an external building envelope from the 1970s, what we will find is a completely non-combustible system with very, very small windows that actually protect us completely from vertical propagation of a flame. What we see from a building facade of today is a continuous system that doesn't have those barriers, that encapsulates numerous plastics to try to actually deliver all sorts of other functionalities, like reducing vibrations, reducing energy consumption, and so forth. But this whole process that is giving us all these other functionalities, this whole process that is giving us a new aesthetic that architects have expanded and multiplied all over the world, at the same time, increase in a very, very significant manner the level of complexity. So think of what we have generated. We have introduced ambiguity that requires competency, and we have significantly enhanced the level of complexity that once again demands competency. So from both sides, we're coming to the point where we are demanding constantly the evolution of our competency to higher and higher and higher standards. And this is where we failed. We failed to make a proper definition of what a competent fire safety engineer is. The moment that we failed to make the definition of what a competent fire safety engineer is, what we create is confusion of competency. The moment that we created confusion of competency, we start asking ourselves the question, who is the competent authority? And this becomes a very unfair working environment, not only for engineers, but also for the fire service. What ended up happening in Grenville was that the engineers delivered a building. Those engineers did not exercise competency adequately. Their competency was not consistent with the complexity of what they were doing. And they delivered a building on fire to the fire service that the fire service could not manage. It was not the fire service failure to address the problem of the building. It is our failure to actually deliver the building that the firefighters could actually work on. So the expectation that the fire service should have understood building performance, the expectation that the fire service should have been able to manage that fire is a really unfair expectation. Nevertheless, today, we're sitting in front of the television watching the testimonies of the firefighters at Grenville, and we are blaming them for what they were not able to handle. We expected them to come and fix the problem for us. We created the mess and they couldn't fix the problem, and now we want to blame them. So we have to be very, very careful, because the problem, and this came up in Judith Hackett's review, The problem is, as a society, we do have an expectation on the fire service, and that expectation is that they are the competent authority. So when you look at Judith Hackett's report, she will state that there has to be a new group of people that actually assess building performance. That group of people includes individuals that understand building performance. That group of people includes people that understand occupational health and safety, and that includes the fire service. Why is that we cannot exclude the fire service? Because the burning building is their work environment, and we cannot exclude them from the process. They have to be part of that process. Nevertheless, when you read Judith Hackett's report from beginning to end, you will find nowhere in that report the competency that is necessary for that fire service to be able to understand building performance at that level of complexity so that they can actually provide adequate advice for building approvals, for building development, but also adequate advice to their own responders to be able to understand to sufficient level building performance so that they can actually implement a proper strategy to fight an event of that nature. So as you can see, at the core of this problem is our enormous misunderstanding of competence. We have enhanced the level of complexity and which have completely underestimated the wake or the implications of our actions, the unintended consequences of our actions. So we have created a system that is way too complex for our current definition of competency. We have created a system that creates too much ambiguity to be consistent with our current definition of competency. And we have created an expectation of competency from the fire service that is truly unfair given the training, education and practices that currently the fire service have. And therefore it is so fundamental to be able to address this problem head on, because that's at the core of what we're doing today. So these problems that we're seeing, these problems that are being evidenced by the Grenfell Tower fire, are fundamentally the tip of an iceberg that truly manifests a poor and misunderstood definition of competency. So I do hope that this brief presentation gives you a little bit of a sense of why this is so fundamental. Being able to deliver a safe environment for occupants of a building is a fundamental social responsibility that we have as governments, as engineers, as professionals. And if we cannot deliver this fundamental level of safety, fundamentally because we're not understanding the limits of our own knowledge, we are effectively not operating within a professional framework. We do hope that this Warren Center project is going to deliver the structure that will allow us as a profession to create an adequate framework of competency that will now enable us to interact with other professions, other disciplines, in a way such that we are respected as a profession. Because the final comment that I want to make is that when you have a poor definition of competency, the only result of that is conflict. It is unavoidable. The moment that we do not define competency correctly, it's very, very easy to avoid responsibilities. It's very easy to point the finger at others. And at the end of the day, the responsibility for fire safety is ours as a profession. And we need to be able to deliver it at a level that is consistent with the complexity, the elegance of the buildings that we want to build, the enormous functionality that we are demanding, and we cannot be the ones who fall behind and eventually end up being responsible, for failures like the one of Grenville. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose, for an excellent overview. If anyone has any doubts about Jose's competence to lead the technical side of this project, please come and see me and we'll have another chat. It's quite phenomenal, the responsibility we have in front of us, but at the same time, the opportunity that this project presents to deliver what could be world-leading solutions to a global problem. The Fire Safety Project has been structured basically with three core pillars of inquiry, which are where we are now, what the future should look like, and what does a professional approach to fire safety engineering look like. And that involves all of you in this room. We need your support to run this project. This project is being run through 35 years of Warren Centre experience in an extremely lean and efficient and collaborative industry approach. We know how to deliver this project, but we need your support, both financial support to run the project and also your support to deliver the culture change we need to address this issue critically. It now gives me great pleasure to formally launch the project and invite Professor Peter Shergold AC to join me in doing so. Professor Shergold AC is Chancellor of Western Sydney University, a former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He now chairs a number of private, public and not-for-profit boards. He has undertaken a number of previous vocational education, community services, major project implementation and Medicare card security reviews. And of course, as all of you in this room would know, alongside Bronwyn Weir, he co-authored Building Confidence, Improving the Effectiveness of Compliance and Enforcement Systems for the Building and Construction Industry across Australia just this year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shergold to officially launch the Fire Safety Engineering Project.
Well, thank you so much. I am very pleased to speak at this official launch of this project on fire safety engineering, or as Dick has reminded us, the second project in effect. It is a major initiative of the Warren Centre for Advanced Engineering and very well worth supporting. We've heard a little bit about the project already from Alex. I have to say, Jose, I've really enjoyed hearing just those few minutes from you, the undoubted expertise that you bring, and an expertise, of course, that did help inform the UK public inquiry into the Grenfell building fire. Now, my name's Peter Shergold, and this is my speech. I show you my speech to illustrate that what I say tonight may be crap, but it's all my own crap. And with my colleague Bronwyn Weir, last year and earlier this year, I undertook a project for the Australian Building Ministers Forum. It was a project on how to strengthen the effective implementation of the National Construction Code. In that report, we made 24 recommendations, which we believed could improve compliance and enforcement systems for the building industry. Recommendations which, in principle, have been broadly accepted by the jurisdictions, although we have yet to see how each government will respond in detail. Our report went far beyond the issue of fire safety and combustible cladding. But here's the truth. It was that dark cloud of Grenfell and the appalling and unnecessary loss of innocent lives that hung over our inquiry and our review. Indeed, it was the Grenfell fire that I suspect was probably the catalyst for the review itself. Bronwyn and I knew, as you all know, that if buildings are not safe, the consequences aren't just technical, they're not just financial, they're human. Mistakes aren't just matters for remediation or for compensation, they're potentially catastrophic. What happened in London can happen, indeed has happened, elsewhere in the world. We saw at the Lacrosse building in the Melbourne Docklands that there, but for the grace of God, could have gone we. These are real, challenging possibilities. Now, Bronwyn and I entitled our report, because we're both punners, Building Confidence. For the challenge as we saw it is to maintain, indeed restore, public confidence in government oversight of the safety of the built environment. Let me return to some of the remarks that Jose made earlier. At the heart of the problem is a public policy dilemma. It's a dilemma that's not unusual in many areas of democratic governance. We prefer today light touch regulations. We prefer that so as not to add costs to construction, burden the industry with unnecessarily prescriptive compliance. We want performance-based assessment of building standards in order to encourage architectural design and building innovation. But we're also required to instill confidence in building owners, in tenants, in residents, in the users of public buildings, and yes, as Jose has said, in those who protect our fire safety. We need to make sure that their safety, not exclusively fire safety, is assured. It is perhaps in the nature of democracy that government interventions are often seen by citizens as yet more symptoms of the nanny state, until the point that a train crashes, or a worker is killed at the work site, or a restaurant customer gets food poisoning, or a building catches fire. And then, quite remarkably, the media and the public ask, where was the regulation? It's the nature of democracy. So, Bronwyn and I asked, how do we balance those competing priorities in a way which gives assurance to citizens that governments are taking their public responsibilities seriously? It requires, we argue, a risk-based, pragmatic approach. It demands not just a construction code that is easy to access and understand and up to date, but perhaps more important, it requires a transparent process to allow the public to see for themselves the extent to which building safety is being effectively implemented. And effectively implemented, let us remember, in a federal system in which each jurisdiction takes its own approaches, although, at least in theory, actually in theory, in a harmonised way and cooperative spirit. Here's the truth. A code, legislation, regulation, or administrative guidelines, a code has little value of itself. The key is to ensure that the standards set are properly understood, appropriately implemented, ethically and competently applied. And that, in the view of Bronwyn and myself, meant, I think, 7 things. These, if you will, are the pillars of wisdom. First, we need consistent requirements for practitioner registration and consistent standards of professional training and career development to ensure the competency that Jose was talking about. Second, we require effective regulatory intervention with a broad suite of powers to monitor building activity and enforce compliance with mandatory inspections. Third, we have to find ways to mitigate the potential conflicts of interest that might influence the conduct or weaken the integrity of private building surveyors, to make the process of building approvals auditable and accessible and open to scrutiny, to give a code of conduct teeth. Fourth, we would benefit from greater collaboration across the sector, not least with the fire authorities in the development of fire safety design. Fifth, we do need independent third-party peer review of decision-making. Sixth, we need a compulsory product certification system for the high-risk building products. And seventh, and I think this is the heart of the matter, we need transparency. Transparency of industry intelligence, transparency of shared data, transparency of documentation, transparency of responsibility and accountability. Most especially, we need adequate documentation of the basis of agreed performance solutions. Performance solutions are a good thing, but we need to have confidence in how they are made. They cannot be, as we heard, sometimes post facto rationalisations of building design mistakes. Performance solutions need to be part of the original design in the pre-construction phase. In short, we need, I think, the power of sunlight to shine on the dark recesses of the building assurance system, so we can see clearly how and when and why building decisions are made. How and when and why building construction is monitored and assessed and approved and, if necessary, remediated. And I think that this important project undertaken by the Warren Centre will help that process. It will allow us to consider how and when and why we need to improve the design and the implementation of fire safety engineering. So I look forward to the reports that will follow. And I am delighted to be here with you to symbolically cut the ribbon and to officially launch this wonderful and very, very important Warren Centre project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, particularly to Professor Peter Shergold AC and José Torero for your wonderful support for this project. Thank you all for being here today. If you are interested in talking to us about your involvement in the project and joining our sponsors, we'd be delighted to talk with you. And of course, I must thank our initial sponsors, the Victorian Building Authority, Scientific Fire Services, and New South Wales Fire and Rescue. Thank you.